Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocates Debate Club. Today, I'm going to talk about a subject that might get a little bit heavy for me, so I'm sorry if this goes long or gets ranty, but today is Mother's Day. So I'm going to talk about the subject of respecting one's parents. I'll start us off with a George Carlin quote. When talking about to the best of my memory at least, when talking about the 10 Commandments and coming to respect or honor thy mother and father, he talked about how this is just an obedience thing, and how the truth is that parents, like everyone else, should have to earn obedience and respect. The quote I wanted to bring up, he said, he said, some deserve it, most don't. Let's move on. The idea being that automatically respecting someone just because of a familial tie is, well, it's a pretty easy fallacy to see. It's not something you should do. Now, obeying your parents when you're growing up is an important part of learning to respect authority, because there are times in life when someone might have an authority over you no matter how distasteful they are. So even if you don't respect your parents, growing up, you should still, for the most part, unless they're telling you to commit crimes or something, obey your parents. It's good practice for the rest of the world. This does not mean that your parents automatically deserve your respect, even if I do feel that to a degree they automatically deserve your obedience. Respect is something that must be earned. I wasn't going to share many personal stories on this channel, and I certainly didn't plan to talk too much about my mother, but as I was preparing for this video, I realized that sharing my personal experiences, or at least some of them, might be the easiest way to get this point across. So I'll start by saying that me and my mother don't speak to each other anymore, that there was a several-year gap when my mother thought that I was racist because of a straw man she had built, something which I had not argued, which she had insisted that I had said and that I believed, and that even though I told her was not the case, she would not believe that her made-up argument about me wasn't the case, and wouldn't speak to me for being racist for several years. My mother, who I've come to realize, despite being woke and anti-bigotry and all that her whole life, is probably one of the most racist people I've ever met, just without realizing it herself. So, we're no longer speaking. I finally got her out of my life. She'd been living on the same property as me. My dad had rented an apartment to her and a house to me on the same property. It's a long story. They've got an even more complicated relationship than me and her do. However, it looks like there's people coming from that way and I don't want to get them filmed. However, now that I've gotten her out of my life, me and my dad finally, after a more than a year-long process of attempting to evict her, got her to move, I don't plan to ever speak to her again. I hate her, and I realize now that I've hated her most of my life, something which I've known off and on throughout my life, but I always tried really hard to get over it, because, well, she's my mother, and you're just supposed to love family no matter what. At least, that's what I was taught growing up from everyone but good old Carlin, and I listened to him on enough things. It's not that this one slipped through the cracks. I listened and to a degree agreed with him on it, but emotionally it wasn't until recently that I was able to start looking at the situation with logic and, well, getting over my mother. So I don't know if she would say that she hates me. I know that that's probably the reality, and that we'll never speak to each other again. She may try to speak to me in the future because, even more than me, she has the emotional attachment of, well, you have to love your son. But you don't. And there are times when you can't. I've not seen the show, but the movie Brightburn from the trailer that I saw seems to be about, a mother loving her son no matter what, even as he becomes a monster and murders lots of people. In that one, the boy is an alien. Maybe it's in his nature. Maybe the mother knows things we don't. In the case of people, though, there are definitely things that a family member can do that can and should cause you to lose respect for them, lose love for them, and potentially, if they take things too far, even hate them. So what has my mother done to me? Well, it started back in childhood. She always taught me that, words couldn't hurt you, and, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And in order to toughen me up, much like the Lucille, the mother in Arrested Development, she bullied me more relentlessly than anyone else in my life, than any school bully, than anyone else I know. She would call me gay until I broke down in tears. And then she would say, well, what are you crying about? What's so wrong? It's okay to be gay. I wasn't crying because it wasn't okay to be gay. I was like a 7-8-year-old kid who was crying because my mother was repeatedly using what in the 90s was one of the biggest slurs to use against a guy in that age category. I didn't really know what gay was yet, but I knew that most people used it as an insult and that my mother was shouting it in my face. She also repeatedly did things throughout my life that, looking back, could have been what was considered to be grooming me to be gay or trans. She offered me on multiple occasions $100 to dress up as a girl for Halloween, something which I eventually did on my own and passed better than expected. But I was doing it for fun, not because my mother was pushing me into it. Also, because I've liked musicals and rainbows and many other things throughout my life, she's many, many times suggested to me that because of my preferences, I might be gay. And because of, I've had many girlfriends, but my girlfriends have never had a specific type. If you looked at all of my girlfriends from in a lineup of like 30 other people and tried to pick which two I dated, if you knew one, you'd probably get the other one wrong because none of them look like each other. Anyway, I just know enough people who have that kind of physical appearance type thing where all of their girlfriends look alike that I know I'm not exactly in the norm there. Well, my mother would use this along with any other leverage she could get to try and convince me that my gender or sexual identity weren't what they were. And they've evolved as I've grown, to be sure. I wouldn't consider myself to be the same as I was back then. But it's been through my own self-reflection. My mother's insistence on certain things being true about me when I was younger. Not even insistence, but just she would never try to push girls on me or anything like that. Anytime I got a girlfriend, she would say, oh, is this your new ex? Is this your next ex-girlfriend? Hey, this must be your next ex-girlfriend. Or even anytime I started hanging out with a girl. She actually did a lot, looking back, to try and push me away from women and towards basically any alternate ideology that she could. It was less so when I was younger, but as I grew up, my mother moved with most of the rest of the left farther and farther left until she became, over the last 5 or 6 years, basically a crazy identitarian who doesn't agree with anything that she would have said 10 years ago. My mother used to be an avid supporter of guns and now sees them just as a way for cops to kill black people, I would assume. We've had talks about this, but her ideology has become so inconsistent as it becomes a mix of, her truly liberal roots and her identitarian reality now that it's hard sometimes to understand exactly what she believes. But it's something I brought up in this video that I think I should go over is my mother's racism. Now, growing up, I always thought my mother was a self-racist, that she was a self-hating white person. this might even be true to a degree. See, she always seemed to blame herself almost when she was attracted to white guys. She hated my dad, probably even when they were together, and ended up marrying and having 2 kids with a black man. And he was the type of person that she would normally stray away from. My mother had taught me that in relationships, it's about love, but it's also about responsibility and the type of person that you're getting involved with. And he was, a felon. He'd attempted to kidnap his own children after the end of custody dispute and had been taken on one of those daytime TV shows over it by his ex. He was an absolute, utter mess of a person. The type of person who my mother, stopping and thinking logically, would never, ever date. And I never, growing up, understood what it was that drew her to him until I read a recent study on the soft bigotry of low expectations. And suddenly all of my mother's racism throughout the years made sense to me. See, she is kind of racist against white people in that she will just say racist things against white people. I know a lot of people say, there's no such thing as reverse racism. Racism against white people doesn't exist. But I got to a point recently with someone who is very far on the left, someone who considers Barack Obama to be far right, who actually agreed somewhat with me on the definition of racism after we'd talked it through, which is that there's the dictionary definition of racism, which does still apply to white people, which is judging someone as different, worse, or better based on the color of their skin. However, the gender studies one, which deals with oppression, shows that, at least in their opinions, racism affects minorities more than it does white people. And so because of that greater effect, they're not comparable as the same thing, and you shouldn't say that it's racism against white people, but there isn't another good word for it when you treat someone differently because of the color of their skin, even if they're white. And what we were able to agree was that maybe a new word is needed, or maybe we need to start differentiating between systemic racism, which is what the left considers to make racism harder for minorities in the first place, and regular racism, which can and does affect every race, including white people. So while my mom absolutely said things like that white people just couldn't understand, something they hadn't been through, because apparently empathy, it doesn't exist, I now realize that she was just as, if not more, racist to the minorities that she spouted protection over. For those of you who haven't read the study, do so. It's absolutely fantastic, and the type of studies that I tend to trust most are ones that go in with a certain perspective. So they go in hoping to prove one thing and actually prove themselves wrong, or find the opposite of what they were looking for, but still admit it in their research. See, if a study goes in looking for something and finds it, that means almost nothing to me, because the results are, going to be stunted by their own perceptions, and any test they did was attempting to garner the result that they got. Whereas if you're attempting to garner the opposite result than what you get, you actually learn something about the world. So the study on the soft bigotry of low expectations was done to find out who was more racist, the left or the right. Basically Democrats or Republicans, but they did more than that with people off the street too. And they took a group of people as well as a group of politicians, and they had the people answer surveys, and the politicians, they did the people, I forget how the survey worked. It had pictures of different people and had them respond accordingly. But for the politicians, which was what was really interesting to me, they took different speeches and addresses that the politicians had given throughout the years and compared the language that they used when speaking with different groups of people. And what they found basically across the board was that Democrats and those on the left were... I consider Democrats to be on the left, but I say Democrats and those on the left because I now realize not everyone does, apparently. It's silly, but anyway. Democrats and those on the left basically across the board used smaller words and simpler phrases when speaking to minorities. They dumbed down their language. Even professors who were tested in this would dumb down their language when speaking with darker children, while they would speak normally to white people and white children. Whereas Republicans didn't do this, and those on the right, I'm not sure why, potentially because their values come out of a religious system that might... I don't know, but Republicans simply didn't do this. They, in their speeches, in their answers to the survey questions, tended to treat everyone equally, regardless of the color of their skin. Now, you might argue that they treat everyone like shit, but even if they're assholes, they weren't racists. At least not according to that study. I do get that there's arguments for systemic racism and how certain political policies might push that more than others, in the opinion of especially the left. Regardless, though, when it comes to how they talk to people, how they deal with people on a day-to-day individual basis, this study showed that the left was rather quite racist. I'm headed towards the street, so I'm going to turn around, I guess. And the right was really quite egalitarian. For those of you who don't know, I might be pronouncing it wrong. I swear I did last time. An egalitarian is someone who believes that all people are equal and should be treated equally. Now, some of you are saying, isn't that a feminist? No. Feminists fight for women's rights. They may say they believe that all people should be treated equally, but they fight for the rights of women. An egalitarian would believe that all people should be treated equally and then fight for the rights of everyone. Egalitarian, sorry. Anyway, that's what I consider myself to be because I think everyone matters. My mother, however, is perhaps the most extreme case of the soft bigotry of low expectations that I've ever seen in my entire life. I grew up with it, and reading that study was like a shutter being removed from my eyes. Because, I mean, even just growing up, my mother treated me differently because I was lighter skinned than my brothers. My brothers, who both have the exact same genealogy, came out looking different. One looked growing up like a Pacific Islander. He had the darker skin but very soft features. And my other is like a black-white guy. He's got the curly hair, he's got, the big the lips, the thick nose. He has the classic black facial and body structure, and he's as white as I am. I mean, physically at least. Anyway, so growing up, my mother treated my brother who had darker skin better than me and my other brother. And I mean, she would not necessarily treat him better, but punish him less harshly and give him more than us. She was more likely to pay him for chores and things like that than us. But also, growing up, I noticed she used smaller words with him and didn't get him as good of an education as me, or insist upon it as much as she did with my other brother. We were both required to go to school, but when the youngest and darkest of us wanted to skip out, she argued with him, but eventually ended up paying for him to do it, to skip school. And argued with me when I fought against it at the time he was living with me for a brief period. And I told him he had to continue going to school if he was going to. So she let him move back in and start skipping school. something she would have never done with either of her lighter children. And it's caused him to grow up with no respect for authority and a destructive personality that I think will cause him a lot of problems later in life, if it's not already. Fortunately, he's on a different landmass now. We've had some fallings out after he tried to kill me, and so we don't speak anymore, just like me and my mother don't speak anymore. But my mother's soft bigotry of low expectations led her to marrying a man she would have never otherwise married. It led her to treat her children differently based on their skin color because she doesn't realize she's doing it. It's all subconscious. The people on the left fight so hard against racism. They believe so strongly that they're anti-racist that they couldn't even possibly imagine themselves being racist. And so when faced with a study like this, they won't even read it. Once they know what the subject matter is, I haven't been able to get a single person on the left to actually read the study that might show them what kind of racist they're being. Because I think when faced with it, people will start to make internal changes. I talked in an earlier video about how my black stepfather beat me growing up. Not beat me, but there were several times when he got physical with me, and it got rather extreme in a couple of cases. And I, for a while, was afraid of older black men. I would be anxious around them when I saw someone who was around his size and age, especially. And it took me years to get over it, and for years I felt like a racist. I felt horrible, and it wasn't until I came to the root of why I felt that way that I was able to get over it. I had to self-examine, realize what had caused me to feel that way, and move on from it. The left needs to do the same, because the more they accept the soft bigotry of low expectations, the more racist they can become. If you'd asked me in the early 2000s when I was growing up, or even as I was hitting adulthood, I guess I was growing up in the early 90s, I was hitting adulthood in the 2000s. Anyway, if you asked me who was the more racist party, without a question I would have said the Republicans. And not just because my mother had raised me to believe that they were evil, but because there were policies in place that made me think of them as the racists. Looking at it now, it is absolutely and growingly the left, increasingly. I'm not saying the left is more racist than the right now. They might be. What I'm saying is the right is moderating, no matter what you think the Trump presidency has done to us. And the left is becoming more and more extreme, mostly through echo chambers on Twitter. So, what's the takeaway from this? Well, I didn't go into all of the details, and I don't want to, but parents can be awful, horrible people, even though there are definitely things that I owe to my mother, that I've thanked her for, and that I still attribute to her when it comes to my personality. She's a horrible person who doesn't deserve my or anyone else's respect. So remember, when you're dealing with family members, you can treat them nicer than everyone else because you're born with them and you have to live with them, but don't automatically respect them. Don't give them the benefit of the doubt just because you know them. Treat people like people. And, maybe we can all get along like a family. Anyway, I'm running out of battery on my phone. It's about to cut me off, I believe. So please like and subscribe. And, of course, drop a comment below. That's what I'm really here for. Anyway, as always, I'm your host, Cipher. Thanks for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. My next video should be interesting. Have a good one.